The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for today's edition to the Canadian Tree Fund webinar series, which aims to bring relevant topics in arboriculture and urban forestry to Canadian arborists. Today's presentation is Digital and Emerging Technologies in the Urban Forest. Our presenter today is Sophie. Sophie's a PhD candidate in urban forestry at the University of British Columbia, researching rules for emerging technologies in urban forest management. The Canadian Tree Fund extends a big thank you to Sophie for joining us here today, and we'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Alex. It's great to be here. So I'll be presenting on a topic that's a little bit similar to what I'll be presenting at ISAO on Friday. But if you're really interested in it, you can come to both and we can have some great different discussions on each presentation. So I'll be presenting an overview of what I've been working on as a PhD student at UBC, in addition to kind of the wider research group that I'm a part of. And I'm also kind of drawing from experiences that I've had working as a forester for the City of Montreal and also as a knowledge mobilizer for the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. It all kind of ties together. And it really does focus on this theme of the intersection of digital and smart technologies and urban forest management and technology pathways and ways forward, and how, you know, the more ubiquitous use of technology might shape, shift, and change the way that we manage trees, green spaces, and natural assets in cities. And let's just make sure that my presentation is switching over here. Here we go. This is an incredibly exciting time to be an urban forester, an arborist, a green infrastructure specialist, and a practitioner in this space. Particularly post-COVID, there's this huge surge of interest in, you know, the management of natural assets, in healthy urban ecosystems, and there seems to also be an incredible kind of investment and incredible value being placed upon these spaces, these landscapes that we manage, and that's really exciting to me. I'm really kind of seeing it happen in the last couple of years, and what I'm also potentially seeing kind of concurrently is there's also an incredible interest in technology solutions for the incredibly complex challenges that we face. So climate tech, disaster tech is showing lots of investment, lots of private sector interest in technology-based solutions for these issues. And that's also translating into urban planning in a way, and urban sustainability, because cities play such an important role, particularly in climate change mitigation and adaptation. And so I think it's worth starting off kind of emphasizing these two key themes, patterns, and trends that seem to be emerging, growing, and shifting, because I think that they're related, and that's kind of what I'm going to be talking about today. And so the first thing that I want to talk about is this broad horizon scan. So a literature review that we did as part of our research group here at UBC. It was funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. And the goal of this was to globally look at, over the last 10 years, what are intersections between digital technologies and forest ecosystems. And so these aren't just urban forest ecosystems, just forest ecosystems more broadly. Of course, that does include urban environments, particularly in more recent years. But it was really a question of getting at, you know, what are current uses and applications for digital tech in forests, and what is potentially coming down the line, what's emerging. So this is just a really quick snapshot of output of research across the globe. And as you can see here, you know, there are some countries that are very well represented. You might not be so surprised. But you can also see that there are some countries that are incredibly underrepresented. And this generally does follow the pattern of the digital divide. If you look at, you know, global maps of, you know, what internet or broadband connectivity might look like, it does often look similar to this. So interestingly enough, Canada places 6th on this list. Make of that what you may. You know, Canada, of course, has a huge interest in forests and I think urban forestry in recent years. And so it is interesting to look at this intersection between tech and forests more globally. And beyond that, we also looked thematically at what is coming out down the line and also currently in research at this intersection. And so there were these 4 broad themes that really emerged, and you can see that this graph represents each year from 2010 until 2020, which is when the search kind of was completed, and this keyword occurrence representing these key themes. So forest cover and canopy, for example, so looking at how technologies can be used to assess canopy and forest cover. Wildfire management was also a key theme. Of course, inventorying, which is not altogether surprising. But what was really interesting is that urban ecosystem planning is really gaining a lot of more prominence and interest in recent years. And one could expect that if this literature review was extended to 2021 and 2022, it's very likely that that pattern would have continued. We also kind of wanted to get a sense of what was perhaps more emerging, and that tends to be characterized by a certain level of uncertainty and also fast-pacedness in terms of uptake. And so these are some keywords that started emerging over the last 10 years. For example, there's interest in automation or automated technologies, virtual and augmented environments, robotics, Internet of Things. These are really kind of the key keywords that emerged as a little bit more uncertain. There's less of a clear kind of linear pattern or prominence happening, but it's clear that there's interest that's growing in the last few years. And for kind of clearer patterns, we were looking at what has been used perhaps more consistently over time, and perhaps like where our use is increasing. And as you can see from this graph, similar type of graph here, unmanned vehicles, particularly unmanned aerial vehicles or UAVs, also known as drones, are definitely increasing in usage in the context of forest ecosystems over time. Machine learning, kind of increased computational capacities have made, and open source models, of course, have made different types of machine learning algorithms perhaps a little bit more available, and they're being increasingly used in the context of forest management, conservation, etc. And of course, remote sensing, which has stayed pretty kind of constant over time, but there is clearly also increased interest in recent years. So this is kind of just to highlight really the key findings and the key themes that emerged from this global scoping review. In addition to looking at these keywords in a bit more of kind of a quantitative way, we also kind of read through some of these key papers that came out of this and looked at the opportunities that the researchers who wrote these papers identified based on the work that they were doing. And here are some kind of significant ones. So automating resource-intensive data collection practices in forests, and that kind of relates to that inventories approach, forest cover and canopy mapping. So the idea of perhaps replacing or, in a complementary way, using technologies to make processes a little bit more efficient. Some technologies, and particularly UAVs, came out in this context, present lower cost and more accessible alternatives. So for example, in relation to perhaps, high resolution, maybe more expensive satellite imagery, UAVs might be an interesting option. Researchers were also interested in data fusion approaches, so using different types of technology, perhaps at different scales, combining them in different ways to get at questions or challenges that we may not have been able to otherwise, or perhaps even combining, different technologies or sensors on one particular device. Open data and open data platforms are also increasing in prominence, and of course that could segue really nicely into potential for the democratization of data collection and analysis methods. So what does this really mean for us? So for urban green infrastructure, urban ecosystems, and urban ecosystem management. So although in our review, we found that globally over the last 10 years, which is quite a big scope, let's be honest, research in this space in urban forestry and urban ecosystem management, it did not feature as prominently. It's very clear that there's uptake, starting in the last few years. So starting in 2017, 2018, at this intersection of kind of digital tech and forest ecosystem management. The very clear use cases revolved around urban forest inventories, so similar to, perhaps non-forest, non-urban ecosystems, vegetation cover mapping, species classification, or at least tree type classification, and also getting at relationships between people and trees, particularly through technology. So for example, virtual or augmented reality. And of course, in the Canadian context, we are at over 80% urban at this point in terms of where people live. across the country. And so it's particularly pertinent to get a sense of, how the profession and how the discipline may be shifting according to these signals of change, technology being a very clear signal and an important one. And so it's worthwhile to start exploring, what this intersection looks like and how it might impact urban livability, sustainability, and how we manage these systems in our urban areas. And one key point that I also wanted to not really focus on, but just kind of touch on, because this is a term that comes up a fair amount in the urban sustainability discourse, maybe not so much in urban forestry, is the smart city. There are lots of different definitions and terms, and it's not necessarily a new term. There are other iterations, for example, the intelligent city, the digital city, that have been floating around since the 1960s or 70s. But it's important to kind of contextualize it and think about it, just because it seems to be driving a fair amount of work that is happening in the urban planning space. I've been working a little bit with an organization called Open North, and their definition is a little bit of a long one, but I think it's quite comprehensive. And of course, in the Canadian context, it's nice to get a Canadian definition in here. So a place where residents, stakeholders, civil society collaborate to mobilize data and technology in an ethical, accountable, and transparent way for urban governance, and to balance perhaps different agendas and different priorities in the context of, urban development, urban planning, and urban sustainability. It's a bit of a long definition. Infrastructure Canada has a little bit of a shorter one, which they used for their Smart Cities Challenge in 2017, and that is simply cities that make use of data and connected technology to improve quality of life. Now, again, I think it's important just to mention this just to contextualize it, because it is a term that kind of floats around a lot, and it's a term that sometimes we use in our research. But it is worth mentioning that the Government of Canada has used this in the past for a program called the Smart Cities Challenge. And there's potentially interest in kind of continuing along this vein and thinking about this term as technology becomes a little bit more ubiquitous in urban planning and in urban governance. And so the way I kind of like to think about it is I like to separate it out a little bit, or perhaps kind of conceptualize it in two major ways. So I like to think about the idea of data and information and technologies, using them, harnessing them to provide services, provide municipal services to citizens. And in this way, I think a little bit like the cloud, a little bit more top down, maybe, where information is sent up, stored everywhere, brought back down when needed, used when needed, to improve municipal service delivery. But I also then like to think about the smartphone, maybe a little bit more bottom up, the potential for a little bit more kind of grassroots, maybe initiatives. And this makes me think about the importance of social capital. So the importance of investing in people and listening to people, and recognizing that communities and community stewardship is incredibly important when it comes to urban governance and sustainability. And in this context, partnerships are very important. And so to me, this kind of encompasses the idea of living in kind of open and smart communities, thinking about the cloud, but also thinking about the smartphone. And so bringing them all together, what does this mean for urban forestry? What does this mean for urban green infrastructure management? So in our research group, these are the kinds of questions that we're thinking about at this intersection of kind of smart, open communities, smart, urban forestry, urban natures. So how can we better understand human-nature interactions in urban environments using digital and smart technologies? What information is useful and relevant for managers and practitioners in the context of planning and management and decision-making? And then what do roadmaps and pathways, technology-focused or otherwise, look like for urban forests and green infrastructure management? So we've, in the last about year and a half, have been engaging in a partnership with Rogers Communications, a telecommunications company in Canada, who are interested in kind of testing out different technologies on their new 5G network. This project is being led by Dr. Loria Nesbitt out of the Faculty of Forestry here at UBC. And we're quite an interdisciplinary group. So we are comprised of folks at the business school, engineering, so applied sciences, urban foresters and urban designers, and we have been kind of setting up the system to pilot different technologies that can be used in the context of urban forest management. And so some parts of this system include UAVs. So we've been testing two types of UAVs, higher end kind of consumer RGB, just a standard kind of camera, RGB sensor. We've also been testing a multispectral drone, looking at different ways in which we can assess urban forest canopy health in addition to green space characteristics and features. We've also installed some ground-based sensors on different trees in 2 sites on UBC campus. And these sites represent a bit more of kind of a managed open green space site and a more naturalized one. And we've also been exploring opportunities to use smartphone location data, anonymized smartphone location data, to look at how people might be moving through the landscape and get a sense of social ecological interactions. And so this is just a couple of illustrations showing our ground-based sensors, which comprise of accelerometers and soil sensors. And these 2 little graphs here just highlight one particular variable. We were looking at tilt and angle from the accelerometers onto, I believe they're red oaks on UBC campus. This is an example of one particular data set. It's not yet available in Vancouver, but someone on our research team has been exploring using it in Portland, Oregon. And this just illustrates visitation rates for different parks across the city of Portland. And we're hoping at some point when the data becomes available to replicate this in Vancouver and potentially correlate that with some data that we've been collecting on green spaces in Vancouver, which is our PASS or UAV-based data. And so we've been collecting data. Now we are at about 27 green spaces across the city of Vancouver. This is quite high resolution data at about 2 to 4 centimeters. And the idea here is to get at, how can we extract features potentially from this data, and how can it inform urban design, and how could it also potentially be combined with other data that we're collecting to better understand, relationships between people and parks, green spaces and trees, and how could it perhaps inform, better design decisions in green spaces. So these are just a couple of examples of the kinds of data and processing power that you get from this. This is just a high-end consumer UAV. It's the DJI Mavic 2 Pro. And you can see that we can get at an orthomosaic, DSM, and point clouds. And we've been working on, data visualization techniques to perhaps get at feature and attribute extraction. Perhaps there's interest in getting at tree height, tree identification, distance measurements, but also areas of interest and maybe even tree protection zones using some of these visualizations. And so kind of to contextualize all of this work, the framework that we've been exploring, or that I've particularly been exploring in my work, is this idea of looking at and understanding urban forests as, yes, social ecological systems where there's a high level of human influence in the system, but also integrating this technological piece. So this idea of these systems really being social ecological technological systems that comprise of social ecological interactions, ecological technological interactions, and social technological interactions. So what does this really mean if we break this down? Well, in this kind of social ecological spectrum, the kinds of interactions that we may be interested in getting at is, maybe what kinds of features of parks most attract people to them. And so I just pasted a little picture here of Google that shows, that some parks are less busy than others sometimes. How you have that little feature when you're trying to decide if you want to go eat at a restaurant somewhere and you don't want to go when it's too busy. What dictates those decisions? And is it related to, the urban forest structure, the characteristics, the amenities in those parks? These are important to know for urban practitioners and urban forest and urban park designers. What are these relationships between people and urban nature? And technology might play a role in getting at or understanding these relationships, but also potentially mediating them. On this spectrum, it may play a bit more of a passive role in the sense that maybe technology is just used for data collection to get at, what these interactions look like, but there may still be a role to play here. when we talk about social technological interactions, one, pretty popular example right now is maybe Pokemon Go. A fun kind of, I guess it's kind of a quasi geocaching app, but not really. But the idea of using virtual or augmented environments to, get people to, or gamify an urban environment, get people outside, perhaps there's a little bit of an ecological component in here. Perhaps it takes on a bit more of a passive role. It's really about the person kind of interacting with people and their phone sometimes. But it's interesting to consider that this still might fall kind of within the realm of the social and the ecological and the technological. And then finally, what do ecological technological interactions look like? Well, how might trees, how might, natural assets interact with sensing devices that we kind of integrate within them? How far can we go with that integration? Are we interested in perhaps more like responsive computing? From a lower tech perspective, we deal with ecological technological interactions on a daily basis. Think about structural soil cells, or even hardscape gray infrastructure. That is a type of technology, and these are quite important interactions when it comes to managing, a healthy urban forest and a resilient urban forest. And so this is just to highlight, what this framework consists of, and how we might really tease out some of these interactions, and how it's important to consider kind of the spectrum of interactions when we're thinking about, managing a resilient urban forest. And when we think about applying technology in the urban forest, it's important to also think about scale. And we've been giving this a fair amount of thought as we've been piloting and deploying some of these technologies. And the ones that we've been looking at are just represented by these cute little icons here. So there's that sensor, which is the Wi-Fi, and the drone and the smartphone data. These technologies are relevant at different scales. We're mostly working within the tree and the site scale, where there may be applications for, all of these at the site scale. But of course, as you kind of move to a bit of a larger scale, maybe sensor deployment, particularly at kind of like a very kind of large scale, might be a little bit more difficult, perhaps down the line. But it's important to consider, the types of data that one is interested in collecting, how it is represented of certain phenomena at different scales, and why it might be useful to informing management decisions. So in terms of lessons learned from this particular project, and if you are interested perhaps in thinking about deploying different technologies in urban forestry, it's definitely important to think about, of course, place-based context and local knowledge. So even just quite simply on UBC campus, a lot of the work went into, permitting processes, figuring out regulations, figuring out what was already known about the landscape, and pulling together, all that different institutional knowledge and data to figure out where the critical gaps were. But what was great is that we developed some great relationships with the arborists and grounds crew who helped inevitably make the system better. Of course, I think that more and more in, the municipal context, we're dealing with bringing together a whole bunch of different experts to the table and finding common vision, and that can still be very difficult. And we found that too with our work, that it was challenging to bring together people with different experiences and different expertise. But it did kind of highlight the potential for public-private partnerships. And although, the structural work of finding that common ground and that common vision, common language can be quite difficult, it could also be quite rewarding as well. And things take longer than one might expect. So one really big finding that we had is that testing and piloting is a huge part of the work. A lot of structural and foundational work is needed to really, move the dial and be innovative and test kind of different methods of collecting data, of using data, even storing data, and figuring out what platforms might work. And so we found that was something that we didn't quite expect, but it's quite important to think about, especially if you're interested in perhaps, pushing the dial a little bit and, doing things in new ways. We've also been interviewing some practitioners in the context of this work to figure out, where the key challenges might be and where key opportunities might be. And this is just a quick list, and I'm happy to take questions on it afterwards, of some of the things that came up in terms of key challenges, in terms of deploying technologies in the urban forest, but also the not so urban forest space. And we found really the key takeaway was that it's not always just about the data and the technology. Often some of the challenges are about the people. the stakeholders and managing expectations and managing people. And interestingly enough, we found that lack of trust in public institutions was sometimes a really big challenge that doesn't necessarily relate only to technology uptake, but it's clear that it might impact and shape how technology roadmaps are developed moving forward. So some of this work has been disseminated, and I'm happy to share some links to this later on, but we did publish our scoping review in a journal called Earth's Future. What's great about this is that it's open access, so you can access it, and I can share a link in the chat. Again, like I said, I've also been working with Open North to write up some white papers, and this is one white paper here, which is about managing urban green infrastructure, kind of with an open smart city lens, where we discuss different potential technologies at a higher level for natural asset and urban forest applications, and really what this means, like what the role of data and connected technology might mean in this space. And finally, or perhaps not quite so finally, but we're reaching the end here. I think it's important as we continue with this work that we think about the signals and trends that are happening here. So how does this all kind of fit together, and how does this all pave the way for what might be coming down the line? How can we perhaps use some of what we've learned, some of these signals, some of these patterns, to figure out what might be kind of plausible scenarios, plausible things that might be coming down the line? And so some of these key signals, I'm going to list them out here, I think are things that are worth thinking about as practitioners in this space. And one really simple one here that I've talked about a fair amount is that there's a lot more availability in recent years of data on urban forests and green spaces. A lot more open source platforms that can be used. For example, Google Earth Engine has been used a fair amount in research right now in the urban ecosystem context. Drones, for example, are becoming much more affordable. And so it's quite easy to go kind of pick up a high-end consumer drone and start collecting a whole bunch of high-resolution data on urban forestry, provided that you follow the law and that you follow also the correct bylaws as well. But there's more and more availability, and that kind of leads to potentially a democratization of data collection and analysis and management, more simply, particularly for municipalities or organizations that may not have the same level of capacity of resources and expertise as larger organizations. Affordable sensing options, so this kind of segues off that other point, both on the ground and in the air. So for example, I think that the new, or starting with the iPhone 12 Pro or something like that, now has LiDAR integrated into the phone. And there have been a fair amount of papers that have come out super recently in 2021 and 2022, looking at the potential for using this technology in the context of forest inventories. So that's quite interesting. And, it perhaps might not be as advanced or as, technically proficient as, more expensive options, but, it could really bridge or fill this interesting gap of, balancing affordability and also data collection in kind of more efficient manner. So I think that's quite interesting. And I think that's definitely a space to watch. Of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that climate change, disaster response, resilient are going to be key themes. This is a trend moving forward. This is something that, should be, at the forefront of everything that we do, really. And particularly in the Pacific Northwest, last summer we had, an incredibly disastrous heat dome and heat waves, which were completely unprecedented. And it's clear that, in some ways, the government and other organizations and intermediary organizations are providing some resources to address these challenges. And I think it's also a space to watch in terms of investment. I think there are going to be lots of programs coming down the line related to investing in climate change, but also in low carbon solutions, such as natural assets and green infrastructure. Community engagement and stewardship, particularly in the context of, technology. Already there are a fair amount of apps that can crowdsource information on biodiversity, plant species, plant ID, urban forest ecosystems. There are also lots of research right now on, e-governance and participatory methods for getting at, how people move through the urban landscape, how they feel about the landscape, digital surveys, et cetera. And also one particularly fun plug is, the Text-to-Tree initiative in Halifax. And so getting at, relationships between people and trees through technology? How can technology mediate these relationships, perhaps even encourage community stewardship? That's a really interesting space to watch. And on that note, I think that, you know, in research, but also in practice in urban forestry, there's a growing interest in health, in equity, but also in play. So how can, you know, perhaps existing games, the idea of gamification and, you know, using our phones as kind of these like play things, contribute to, you know, wider societal or addressing wider societal issues and challenges. So there was this paper I came across really interestingly looking at, you know, the potential for Pokemon Go to contribute to conservation. There is a really interesting research group out of Finland looking at different ways in which gamification in forest ecosystems can contribute to sustainability initiatives. And, you know, there are already lots of video games on climate change and stuff like that that are coming down the line too. And so I think that this is kind of a wider trend that in not just urban forestry, but I think just in technology more generally, in games, in video games, that I think would be a really cool space to watch as urban forestry practitioners moving forward. I think that there's a space for us here. And on that note, I think that it's really important to mention that, you know, when I started my PhD a few years ago now, this wasn't being talked about as much. And I think that this has really come to the forefront of the smart cities, urban technology discourse, you know, this idea of equity, this idea of really stepping back and being cautious about how we use technology, and the idea of thinking about the importance of the value that we create when we use technology. It's not just about kind of applying a whole bunch of technology now and seeing what sticks. There's a bit more, you know, value being placed on, you know, thinking critically about, you know, what technology is useful, what problems are being, you know, truly addressed here. And I think the same can be said for urban forestry in a way. I think that we're really moving beyond, you know, this idea that, you know, trees everywhere are just good. We just need to convince people that trees are good. People know this now. And, you know, there's an increasing focus on health and equity and being very, you know, critical about how we manage these systems. And that's a really interesting intersection that's also happening in this space that I think will pave the way for, you know, truly resilient outcomes in urban forest management, which I think is quite exciting. So just a quick sneak peek, this is coming out very soon, but there's a special issue of Arboriculture and Urban Forestry coming down the line on smart urban forestry, lots of really interesting research on new remote sensing methods, AI in arboriculture, big data, e-tools, you don't want to miss it. And we are still interviewing experts who are working in urban forestry, and particularly if you're interested in applying digital technologies, or if you already are applying digital technologies, we would love to hear from you. As I said, this study is funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. And if you're interested in being interviewed and having your say and basically talking at me for an hour and a half, feel free to email me at that email address here, which I can also post on the chat. And finally, before we get going into a discussion, I would like to thank, you know, my research group, of course, but also generous funders such as, you know, Rogers, UBC, MyTax, and CIRC and SHIRK. So that's it for me. Thank you so much for being here and for listening. And I'm really excited for the discussion that's to follow.
Thank you very much, Sophie. Anyone who's attending today, a reminder to submit your questions into the question box. We'll go through and answer them. In the meantime, what do
I don't know if you wanted me to keep sharing my screen, by the way. Sorry, I just kind of stopped. But
up to
all
you.
right.
Do you think how do you see this these different technologies fitting in for smaller municipalities, kind of municipalities on the threshold of urban forestry, whether they're just getting into kind of developing an urban forestry department, or perhaps they don't really have a dedicated department, they're just starting to introduce kind of these concepts into their governance structure, into municipal discussions?
That's a great question. And, you know, I'll be honest, I don't have all the answers here, but I think that what's really interesting as an opportunity for perhaps smaller and mid-sized municipalities that have yet to kind of create this more institutionalized process for urban forestry is that there's a lot of flexibility and, a lot of agility in terms of what can be done. And so I would say that it's important to consider, local, place-based issues, needs, and knowledge, and start from there. And I would highlight that there are, a fair amount of technologies out there, particularly related to kind of data collection and inventorying, that are affordable right now. So there is, for example, like satellite imagery that's, been around for quite a long time, that's, free to use or easy to access. And, Google Earth Engine, for example, is one option there. Again, the idea of UAVs becoming increasingly affordable, especially to pinpoint certain areas. If you're interested maybe in collecting data on a smaller scale, but perhaps more consistently to get at some key issues, that's a really interesting approach to filling in that gap between like scale and affordability. But again, as I've mentioned, I think that we've really moved beyond this idea of basically kind of testing out a whole bunch of technology and seeing what works. I think that what's really important is getting at what are the key needs and how can you scale up from there. And those are some of the opportunities that we've been thinking about in our research too. Like, does it make sense to scale up like a whole bunch of ground-based sensors? Maybe it does, maybe only in certain contexts. Does it make sense to like scale up and have a fleet of drones, monitoring a whole city at a time? Unclear. I think it's really a question of connecting, needs, challenges, problems, scale, and then the technology that really helps address that. That's a great question, though.
On the point of ethics as well, I think I've heard you discuss this previously, but when you get into kind of the scope of using drones in neighborhoods, whether in mass or the large drones that we might see with LiDAR units, how do you navigate whether it's direct public criticism or kind of a cautionary view of drones being used by the government or by researchers in a neighborhood setting?
That's a fantastic question. And I would say that answering this doesn't necessarily only relate to drones. I think that it could be applied to, a wide range of technologies that perhaps people are worried have a bit more of a surveillance focus. So even, for example, smartphone location data, I think that it's worth, being cautious about that too. And I would say that one needs to have a certain level of kind of accountability and transparency. And so I think the governments should be, if it's kind of in government hands, should be very clear about, the type of data they're collecting, why, and if it's possible, if, the situation allows for it, why not make that data open and publicly available? From kind of a privacy perspective in particular, I think that it's important to be cautious about how much data one actually collects. One doesn't need to collect, let's say, the highest resolution data possible all the time so that you can see, what people are doing in their backyard. I think it's a question of really considering what a minimum, viable resolution or data product might look like to address the particular challenge or need that you're looking to address, and being very clear and transparent about that. And I think that it's possible. I'm also kind of not a legal expert in terms of like technology ethics and accountability and privacy, et cetera. But even just, from technology, urban forestry, like challenge needs perspective, it makes sense that you don't necessarily need to, get at that like finest scale possible to perhaps address a problem that makes sense at a wider scale. I was recently in a webinar with someone who works on wildfire research in California, who uses high resolution cameras. And what they do is to prevent kind of privacy issues and surveillance issues, they actually blur out certain features of the landscape, right in the process itself of collecting the data, to be as accountable and like privacy and ethics oriented as possible. So that's a particular example, but those types of solutions are possible. And again, I think it really comes down to being critical about how one is using technology and how one is collecting data and why.
Terrific, thank you. Great ethical focused answer. There's another one that kind of moves towards some NSERC related topics. Here, the question is, can you give a sneak peek or expand a bit on the topic of artificial intelligence and risk assessment?
I believe, actually, if I'm not mistaken, there's going to be a presentation given at that at some point soon. But the idea of being able to kind of use AI in diagnostics. So I can't speak too much to it because I'm, of course, not the expert on that. But of course, it's a question of using algorithms that perhaps mimic or get at the ways that we might do kind of risk assessment and diagnostics. So whether that's through like training models, depending on the certain kind of situation, perhaps it's a pest or something that you're looking at. Perhaps it's a question of like crowdsourcing as well. So getting at like a whole bunch of different images or models or perspectives, pulling it all together, and then coming up with what might be like the most probable solution. I can't get into it too much, but I think that it's an interesting space to watch from the perspective of perhaps making diagnostics a little bit more, I hesitate to say standardized, but perhaps it's a way to complement the way that risk assessment is done currently, and perhaps it's also a way to evaluate whether methods should be enhanced, changed, shaped. I haven't worked as much in the risk assessment space. I did work as an inspector for a couple of years, but yeah, I think that there's perhaps a lot of ways that could take shape, and it would be interesting to look at how context specific and local those methods really are.
As a very related kind of theme to that, there's been a number of discussions over the past few years, especially at the ISA conferences, about the use of drones at the individual tree level for plant healthcare assessment, also tree risk assessment as well, but plant healthcare assessment. We know that in forest resource management and forest operations, the use of drones and LiDAR technology at larger scale for plant healthcare has been used in mountain pine beetle attacks or for root pathogens and their spread from a central point. Do you see this technology being used increasingly for things that are impacting the urban forest, especially like emerald ash borer, Dutch elm disease, black knot?
Yeah, I mean, drones are a little bit tough because the regulations in North America are still fairly stringent, and there are also local bylaws that often prevent the use of drones in particular spaces. And so, of course, you can go through the licensing process and all that. I'm just speaking kind of from a process-based perspective. So there are still a little bit of limitations in terms of that. But from a plant healthcare perspective, I think that there's kind of lots of potential for these affordable drones to get at urban forest structure. And so, previously when you perhaps needed to kind of combine, ortho with maybe LiDAR or et cetera, to get at structure, let's say height classes, or even get at, what you have in the urban forest, like that has been challenging. And also drones with LiDAR are still kind of expensive, but these more affordable drone options with just this RGB sensor create point clouds from tide points. And so that's kind of interesting, is you have this perhaps, complementary tool that's a little bit more affordable, a little bit more flexible, that can get at, structure in a really easy way, just to get a snapshot of what's there. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is that, there are some drones now that have multispectral sensors, which can get at plant health, especially maybe as you fly like throughout the growing season. And maybe you can also get at like drivers of stress based on, when you fly. And that's also kind of interesting, is that, drones provide the opportunity to fly basically whenever you'd like, weather dependent. And so if there's a particular site or a particular issue that you're really interested in getting at, so for example, emerald ash borer, perhaps, there are sites that you want to get at, early detection, perhaps there are some that are of interest, you can basically go whenever you'd like and, track over time these like perhaps finer scale interactions or phenomena that you might not have previously, or that would be very expensive if you're, let's say, using satellite imagery and having to buy that every week or something like that. And so I think that there are many different ways in which drones could be used to get at different characteristics and different features of the urban forest. And it's important to kind of be critical about that. So, given the challenge or the need that you're looking at, what sensor is really going to give you that information? How much are you willing to pay for it? And also, how much or how willing are you to fly or collect that data? Of course, storage, analysis capabilities, and all of that, comes into play too. But how can you really, like, at a higher level, use that technology to get at like the scalar phenomena that you're really interested in looking at? So yeah, I hope hopefully that answers your question. I went on a bit of a tangent there. Oh, I can't hear you. Are you on mute? Maybe it's my fault.
Thank you. No, I was on mute. Related to data collection, David asked a question that is, he's interested in how researchers collected the park user data, especially how long park users stayed in the park, the duration.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so the data for Vancouver, at least using the data source that we are using, is not yet available. But the one in Portland, so the organization is called SafeGraph, and they have kind of a repository of smartphone-based data. And what it is that it's third-party apps that collect our data. So often whenever you download kind of an app on your phone, there's terms and conditions, and you either agree or disagree to have your data collected. And it's, I'm not entirely sure what the system is, so how many pings, for example, are pinged to like know how long you stay in a park, but there is a variable. So there's not only, let's say, park visitation, so number of visitors that went to a particular park, there is also a variable associated with how long on average or in aggregate people stayed in parks. There's a lot of aggregation that goes on here in the back end because we're dealing with big data, and so there needs to be a lot of aggregation. And I, of course, don't know exactly what methods they used because often these organizations have their own algorithms and methods that they use. But there are variables that associate not just visitation, but also length of time staying in parks, and also sometimes distance. So how far people travel to actually get to a particular point of interest, such as a park.
During the COVID-19 pandemic, Google made their Google Mobility trend reports more publicly available than they were. Do you think that kind of remaining public openness around mobility trend research from kind of the large data side of things is beneficial to municipalities that might not have a collaborative engagement plan with a university or with a college that they can work alongside?
I think so. I think that there's a lot of interest in mobility data generally, but there's still a bit of a challenge in terms of where that data is available, what it looks like, and how to use it. I mean, big data is tough. You often need kind of like specialists, like data scientists, to figure out how to use it. And so to kind of make these types of reports, which, aggregate a lot of data and kind of do a little bit of the work for you, I think is useful for these kind of higher level patterns and trends and to understand what's happening. And I mean, one perhaps upside of the COVID pandemic is perhaps it has, increased interest in figuring out, how people are moving in a more ambient way through a city landscape. I mean, we've relied historically on kind of census data to understand metrics of density and where people might be going based on where they live. But, mobility data does add a certain element of this more kind of ambient movement that I think is, a pretty significant part of urban design and urban livability. And I know that there are a few municipalities in Canada who are using the Google Insights Explorer, which sometimes I think that there are representatives that could partner with municipalities to look at particularly travel mobility, so modes of travel, how people move through a city, so like pedestrians, bikes, cars, etc. And I think that is probably something that will continue on, particularly as Google fleshes out what that Insights Explorer looks like and what it's going to be about.
Awesome, thank you. Switching themes again, would you be able to expand on how we can use gamification? Bridget says, I think we heard of one neighborhood which encouraged residents to adopt a tree in their area, and they could upload pictures, see pictures of other trees in their neighborhood. I'll add to that as well. There's the one in the UK, or no, the one in Australia, I think, the Hug a Tree, where they started something like that, and then people wrote love letters to trees in their urban neighborhood, and it kind of fostered a little bit of conservation efforts there.
Yeah, the tree mail phenomenon. Yeah, that was great. To be honest, this is still fairly new to me, so I can really only be speculative in that regard. I do know that the research group out of Finland that really looks at gamification in the forest context are interested in wearables. So how, for example, one might, let's say, gain points or something like that through a particular app by maybe, getting at nature exposure or going for a walk in a forest or something like that, and then tying that into a points-based or whatever else rewards-based system. And those already exist. I think that there are points-based apps for reducing your carbon footprint. And so why not have something similar for, going out into a park and spending 30 minutes there? And the Pokemon Go thing is also kind of interesting. So I haven't played Pokemon Go that much, but the idea that one could perhaps use a game-based app to get people outside and also perhaps maybe like recreate concepts related to Pokemon Go in maybe like an urban forest stewardship context, whatever that might look like. The idea of perhaps using like augmented reality for like educational purposes. So maybe you like download an app on your phone or something like that. And then there's kind of this like augmented interface if you're, outside or maybe not, that perhaps, teaches you certain things related to urban forestry or maybe like municipal sustainability or something like that. And maybe there's also an interface where you could contribute to that. And it's, again, like a rewards-based system. I think that there are like a fair amount of opportunities in that space. And I think that that's where, game psychologists and maybe like video game developers could really come in, because they know what really attracts people and what works in the context of gamification. Whereas as urban forestry practitioners, we kind of know ecologically maybe what is sound. And so combining that, I think, could be really interesting.
Well, on that as well, I believe at the ISAO conference, Cecil and Matilda Van Bosch are talking about kind of these concepts with human health and getting people outside. But the Canadian government, at least in Manitoba, gave family physicians one national park pass to hand out to any of their patients. I don't remember how far replicated it is across Canada, but
yes,
those
I
types
did hear
of
about that, the Park RX program.
Yeah, and those types of initiatives to kind of get people outside and see access to nature is important, but and also use of nature as a kind of a component of health and well-being. Do you see things like Pokemon Go and stuff like that being able to work collaboratively in kind of this interdisciplinary sense of medical practitioners as well as video game designers as well as urban foresters to kind of create a tech-friendly but also kind of attractive experience where we might not have had if we weren't getting people into the parks before, we might be able to adapt and find new ways to encourage people to get outside.
Totally. I mean, I have no idea, but I think that sounds really interesting, and I would love to research that. I mean, I think that there is something to be said for, the video game industry, the media industry generally. There's a lot of potential to perhaps, combine like more like physical reality in that, people are already interested. I mean, I hate to say this, but the metaverse, like whatever you think about it, there's this interest in kind of intersecting the physical and the virtual already. And I think that's why I kind of put this idea of health and play in here, in that I think that one can encourage healthy behaviors through play. And, there are already apps that work on that. There are already lots of, let's say, physical activity apps, lots of like gym apps and all that kind of stuff that work on rewards-based systems and play gamification systems for encouraging healthy behaviors. And we know that, going out into nature and experiencing that as a healthy behavior, I would just be cautious about, whether part of the health aspect of being out in nature is disconnect from technology. So you end up with a little bit of this contradiction or paradox, perhaps, where like, if a technology application is encouraging you to get out in nature, is it also maybe encouraging you to disconnect? And that's perhaps entirely possible. Maybe you're wearable and your phone like shuts off automatically when you're like out in a park somewhere. That would be kind of interesting. I'm not entirely sure, but I think that that's also why more research is needed on the role of technology as a mediator for human nature relationships. And that's really maybe where we can get at this intersection of like what would be the ideal balance between, you know, technology usage, health, and like exposure to nature. And that really also gets at kind of our intrinsic affinity for nature. How much does technology play a role in that? I think jury's still out, but it's really interesting to explore.
And at 9:59, or well, 12:59, that seems like a great place to wrap up. So thanks again for presenting, Sophie, and thanks everyone for joining us today. Had a great turnout. Before we bid adieu, as always, the Canadian Tree Fund invites you to consider donating to the organization. As Bridget just said in the chat, you'll get a CU for attending, and it's automatically applied to your account. I'm going to post a link in the chat here to go and donate to the Canadian Tree Fund. If you donate $20 or more, you're issued a tax receipt. So there you go in the chat there. For those who don't know and are joining us for the first time, the Canadian Tree Fund is a registered charitable organization. We partner with the ISAO to bring you these webinars. If you're going to the ISAO conference, I will see you at the AGM, hopefully, and we'll all have a dinner together virtually as we sit down and talk about the Canadian Tree Fund. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for their support and for joining us today. Thank you, Sophie, for joining us, and thanks to the ISAO for hosting.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Sophie. Bye.